They're basically going to start right now, I guess. So he's talking about abortion. So I asked him what claim does he want to defend before we move on into a debate. He's not really given the claim the first time, but after 11 repeated dodges or consecutive dodges, he finally gave a claim, which is that he thinks I have insufficient justification for abortion being something which is immoral. Now, when we delved and analyzed into the reason, he basically appealed to the idea of it not being sufficient justification because it's not convincing. So I asked him afterwards, how does it follow from something not being convincing that it is not sufficient justification? It cannot be convincing to someone like you who is retarded and is intellectually disabled because you can't track the argument properly. Doesn't mean that it is insufficient justification when you're talking about the facts of the matter here. So now I'm going to ask you the question, how does it follow from the persuasive standard you're appealing to, Shinner, that it is insufficient justification? Now let's see if he's going to continuously ape out and crash out like he's been doing for the last 11 minutes and just focus on the insults, or what he's going to do instead is not focus on the insults and try to pack with his trash African accent and try to give some legitimate arguments for his claim. Let's see what he's going to do. Let's see if he's going to do something impressive for once. Go ahead, Shinner, talk.
Who are you speaking to? Not a single person in this video. They're here to watch you get embarrassed, you fat lazy fucker, right? For one. And then two, this all just seems like a very weird, convoluted attempt to stop and not defend the abortion argument, which you posited to me the last time I beat your head in, you fat, ugly Jamaican piece of shit who still can't make ends meet, which is why you sit there on Discord asking Vinny for money, you scum, right? But I'm going to ask you again in my infinite generosity, please lay out the argument, lay out the argument, right? Lay out the argument, right, for the proposition that abortion is morally unjustified, and then we can inspect the argument and see whether or not it actually holds true and whether or not it actually is convincing within the domain of discourse. You dumb fucking piece of shit, bastard nigger. Now I'm done.
Holy shit, bro. What the? Oh, I'm unmuted. Holy shit, you guys were supposed to hear that one.
Yo, nigga, you definitely know you're unmuted, bro.
What up, guys? What up, guys? How y'all doing?
I mean, that's serious. I didn't know. No, I genuinely didn't know. No, this explains everything. You know, all those posts, those videos about that one guy over the past 5 days. You could just hear the rage in his voice. This sort of infiltrator just popping out. Just doesn't have any arguments. Now, Shinner, we can play the packing game. I know we'll pack the fuck out of you pretty easily. Right? We can play that game. We can play the insult game. But we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that because guess what? I'm not going to stoop down. Free to go. What are you doing? I'm still talking. Just give me a second, man. Let me cook. So, Shinner, I'm not going to stoop down to your levels. I'm not going to stoop down to your apish levels, your apish standards, where you just resort to the sort of insults because you don't actually have any arguments. So let's just focus on a couple of things. Let's just do a recap for the audience, including my most fellow decriers, which is meat. What can I say? Slurping my meat. Let's just talk about the arguments. Okay, so first and foremost, he made the claim that he had, or rather I had, insufficient justification. That was his original claim. Okay? Now, what he did instead, I don't know who that is, but, let's just ignore that. What he tried to say was that the reasons why this insufficient in justification is based off the fact that the reasons I've given is not convincing. So I've just asked him a while ago for the connection between something not being convincing and something being the type of thing which is not sufficient justification. And what he did instead was resort to the ad homs, the insults, the sort of like personal attacks, the racist attacks. Don't even know why he's calling me out to be a Jamaican when he's a Nigerian who literally had to cross the fucking border on the fucking boat. That's fucking crazy. But moving on from that, before we focus on Shinner's personal life, which no one on Discord or even in Gaza would ever exchange their lives for, right? We're going to focus on Shinner's arguments, which actually we can't because he didn't give a fucking argument. So I'm going to repeat this one more time, give an argument for the claim that my evidential standard or my evidential justification for abortion being immoral is something which is insufficient. If you have no sort of evidence whatsoever and you're going to continuously appeal to the insults and crash the fuck out, then I'll take this as a concession on that claim. And then I'm going to re-ask you the question, which is what claim are you willing to defend against me? And if you're going to dodge that question again, like you've done on numerous different occasions in the past, then I'll take a claim for you because you're scared to actually talk about any sort of topic where you have to defend a position. And then from there on, I'll just demolish you again for the fourth time that we've debated for, I guess, in the past year or so. So give a response. Let's see if we can do a better response this time. Go for it. Done talking.
You're out of breath for the entirety of that ramble fest. I just want you to know that. But look, man, I'm entirely inferior to the King Malik guy in terms of disco debate prowess. So I'm going to need you to please defend your abortion argument. Like maybe if I say to you like this, no, sorry. You're a good boy, Apollo. You're a very good boy. So please be the good boy you are and lay out the abortion argument so I can defeat it soundly, okay? Good boy. Now, please, give me the argument. Thank you.
Yeah, so in other words, he did not give the justification for the claim that my evidence for abortion being immoral is something which is insufficient. So that's a concession on the first claim. So that basically just got retracted and just, dismissed from the conversation because he retracted that claim. He had to backpedal on that because he couldn't prove that claim. He realized his first reason was fucking dog piss and failed horrendously. Moving on to the justification I have for abortion being immoral, because you want to take the agnostic, skeptical stance because he can't argue for shit. He can't fucking debate for shit. He's just a trash fucking debater who regurgitates arguments he hears from fucking Eric and reads in papers instead of creating anything on his own with his fucking goldfish pea-sized brain. I'm going to be doing the argument, and let's see what you can give in response to my arguments, okay? So I'm going to re-give the arguments I've given you the last time, okay? So, the pro-life position. Who's talking? Go for it.
Yeah, look, we're going to get a strip on his wrist, kid. He can't stop miking up.
Why did you have to talk, bro?
Yo, I'm bad at Nexus.
Yo, Nexus, shut the fuck up, nigga.
So, wait, Kura, just let me finish. Let me land, Kura. So, the argument for pro-life being the case, because we know for a fact that killing innocent human lives is immoral. That's generally immoral, right? If not in all cases immoral. So in the case of abortion, for example, in the case of abortion, whereas a fetus is a human life, it's an innocent human life, it's never done something wrong. It is the case that killing a fetus would be immoral. Killing a zygote would also be immoral. These things are by definition human lives, and they're by definition something which is innocent. Because for someone to be classified as something which is innocent or someone which is innocent, it has to be the case that it has never done something wrong. Right, that's the sufficient condition for innocence by a legalistic standard and by a moralistic standard. Right, this is the criteria which determines innocence. So unless you want to retract or reject the claim, that this thing is the type of thing which is innocent, which is a fetus or a zygote respectively, then you'd have to basically justify as to why it would be something which is guilty, because it's a true dichotomy. Either something is innocent or something is guilty of a crime or guilty of some immoral action, or does immoral actions or execute immoral actions. We know for a fact that fetuses and zygotes do not actually have the sort of capacity to execute actions, much less immoral actions. So it renders them as the type of entities which would be something which is innocent. So they're innocent, and by definition, by the biological standard, which is backed by the evidence, they would by definition be human life. So they would be innocent human lives. To deny the position of abortion in the case of where the exceptions of the rape case scenarios, or with the exceptions of where the mother's life is at risk, you'd have to be vouching for it being okay to kill innocent human lives, just based off the fact that you don't want that innocent human life to exist. And that allows for plenty of cases.
Hey, I wish you got aborted, you dumb fat black rasta!
Wait, just damn, that's crazy. Let me just repeat that last part because I got drowned by the loud mic. So to deny the claim that killing fetuses and zygotes is something which is immoral results in you having to agree that there are in fact some cases, or there are cases in which it is completely okay to kill innocent human lives just based off the fact that you don't want that innocent human life to exist.
Oh, Claude, but I got Zeke.
And so that allows for cases where something like Jeffrey Dahmer killing people, innocent human lives, for example, is something which is okay. It allows for plenty of cases which are objectively immoral to now be morally justified given your moral scheme and system. So what's your response to this argument, Shinra?
What's the response to the 100-minute argument?
Nigga, shut your bitch ass up. That man's black. Could I smack the fuck out you?
Anyways, ignoring that guy. Look, Apollo, the response is pretty simple. One, I think you defined... Okay. Yeah, I think you defined innocence wrong. You defined innocence as on never doing something wrong. I think that's misdefined for a variety of reasons. One, because that would posit that my TV is innocent, my table is innocent, my chair is innocent. Trivially, we wouldn't say these sorts of things are innocent because they don't have the capacity to do things wrong, right? Obviously. So again, trivially, I think that for something to be innocent, it means that it must have capacity to do things wrong, right? However, it willingly chooses not to do so, which is what would make it innocent for one. Two, I'd like to posit to you an analogy. Imagine came into existence with his fist placed inside of your urethra, right, causing you to have excruciating levels of pain for a 9-month period, and Mercury is non-sentient, is it morally justified for me to take his life so he removes his hand from my urethra? The answer is yes, because he is violating my rights without sufficient justification. In most of these cases in which you say that it is morally justified to take another person's life, e.g. I kill somebody in self-defense, the reason would be because they're trying to violate my rights without sufficient justification. The same sort of principle would apply in the case of abortion, right? Again, I'm going to ask you another question, which is, what is the relevant distinction between a rape case, the case in which the mother is aborting the fetus to protect her life, and the regular abortion case, aside from the fact that there's just a greater right violation going on there? Please give me a response.
Well, personally, you've just laid out the distinction yourself, you moron. The distinction is one is caused by rape, it's rape induced, and the other isn't. That would be the distinction. Now, I guess to reframe your dumbass question, which is what's the more relevant distinction, right? You can be someone who doesn't know the specific details of the specific traits which generates the morally relevant distinction, and still believe it to be the case that there is in fact a distinction, and you're justified in believing such. You can be justified in believing that there's a morally relevant distinction based off the intuitions we have about rape cases in contrast with the intuitions we have about, let's say, a case where you could say the mother was not being raped or was not being impregnated as a result of involuntary sexual intercourse. That's just the response to that part. I can go in further details to address that part or that point you've made, but it's so low tier, it's not even worth my attention that much. So moving on to the other part, you made the claim that innocence is not just doing something. Dude, we have in the screenshot I've just posted the dictionary definition of innocence, or what it means to be innocent. It's not be guilty of a particular crime or offense or immoral action, right? So if it is the case, which it is, that a fetus would not be guilty of a crime or any particular crime, you could say it's an innocent human life, it's the most vulnerable human life in existence, then by definition it would not be something which is, it would by definition be innocent, I should say. It's not going to be something which is guilty or any of that. It's innocent by definition. The definition is stating here that simply not being guilty of a crime or offense is what makes something innocent. Now you talk about the idea of innocence implying this sort of agency or personhood. That's not even true, right? So for example, let's say you have a case scenario where two persons were to be put on trial regarding some sort of like school shooting incident, okay? One of the persons are, let's say, you, for example, right? You basically were put on trial because they suspected you to be the school shooter because you got bullied at school every single day for being a fucking black loser who was an immigrant. And the other person is currently in coma, okay? Now, they did some research, basically. I forgot the specific legal term for this, but they did some investigation into the incident, by the way. And they realized that the person who was in coma could have not done the action because at the time when the action happened, that person, what are they doing with the music? Stop that, please. The person who is in the coma could have not done the action because at the time when the action was being executed, that person was still in coma. Right, so there's like some sort of like mishap so far as the investigation is concerned. Now, obviously, any sort of legal, you could say, person who works in the legal field would say, even if that person who is in coma could have not done the action, by definition, that person would still be innocent, even though he did not have the capacity to do the action at the time. So it is not the case that innocence hinges on, let's say, the capacity to do the action, but rather you can be innocent without having the capacity to do the action, right? So that's not a necessary condition of innocence, and that's established by my definition. And so you're not really objected to the other part of the argument. So let me see if you can object that part regarding the general trend of the innocent human lives being killed to be immoral, and then we can move on from there.
Okay, so one, the trend doesn't need to be a for one, you're an idiot. And two, again, I asked you for the distinction. You didn't tell me. All you did is just, I can be justified in believing that there are more distinctions, right? But even though I'm unable to name any, right? That doesn't tell me anything, nor does it even answer my question. So I appreciate how you dodge my question so eloquently right there. But supposedly the thing you're going to fall back on is saying that well, we do have justification in believing that there is a morally relevant distinction because there's difference in terms of intuitions in these two cases. One, I don't grant that. You need to give me an argument as to why there's a difference in intuitions in both of these cases. And two, I need to give you to give me an argument as to why that is the case, even upon reflection. If we look at the sort of facts in detail, right, about both of these cases, right, and we analyze them, I don't grant that people would have intuitions towards it, right? Especially when, if I ask the average person what is the morally relevant distinction in both of these cases, they wouldn't be able to tell me. That's one. And then two, again,
Shinra, pause real quick. I'm sorry. Yo, after you give this response, we're gonna move the debate to stage because like these guys can't control themselves. So
yeah.
sorry.
And what's it called? Two, again, to be not guilty implies that you are immoral. Right? I'm gonna give you an example. If I throw a rock at somebody, the rock hit somebody's head and then ended their life, right? We wouldn't say that the rock is guilty of any crime. We would say the person is actually guilty because the person is the moral agent who is choosing to do the action. The analogy you gave me is completely disanalogous because of the fact that that person who was in a coma, previously they were, at least I'm going to assume, previously they had the capacity or they were displaying moral agency in the sense that they previously had consciousness. Now, if you were to say that so they never had sentience, right, and they never had consciousness ever in their life, then yes, I do believe that it would be incoherent to say that they are guilty or innocent of any specific crime because I don't believe they are the type of being who can be innocent or guilty. The definition you provided to me doesn't support your argument, and it's actually pathetic how you try to approach the conversation in such a dishonest manner. So please end your life, you fat Jamaican prick, right? Or give me a proper response, you loser bastard. Or beg me for nitro at that, you scum. Anyways, now I'm done.
Yo, we're gonna move the debate to stage. Everyone go to stage. Let's get it, man.
Let's go.
Your last word, nigga.
I love you.
All right, let's continue from
Yeah,
here.
buddy, you can't cook.
By the way, wouldn't the recording bot get kicked?
No, I'm
Or did you
recording,
guys
bro.
keep
I'm
it?
recording, baby.
I
Recording,
wasn't
bro.
asking you, dude.
Yeah,
So
shut up,
just to
scum. I
respond to the
answered anyway,
argument, yeah,
pussy.
just pipe down, monkey. It's my turn to talk now, okay? Let's just keep things
Oh,
consistent.
good boy,
So just to
good
respond to the
boy.
argument that Shinner is given, I don't know why he's moaning in the background. That's really strange. Now, to actually give the argument that he was basically begging for, well, actually, I've given the argument again, or already, but I'm going to give the argument again, I should say. You made the idea that there's no sort of like justification of given, which is sufficient for the claim that abortion would be immoral in the cases we're talking about. And you proceeded to say that I eloquently dodged your question, which is not even the case. Your question was you asking me for the distinction between one case scenario where the mother gets raped and the other case scenario, and I've answered the question. And then I've explained to you as to why there would be evidence for there being a morally relevant distinction, given the vast amount of intuitions that people have regarding it being moral in some case, it being immoral in the case where, you know, the mother gets or the mother does not get raped for her to abort the fetus, and it being the type of thing which is moral in the case where the mother did in fact get raped. So they agree, or rather by them specifically talking for lifers, they have different intuitions dependent on the fact about the mother getting raped. So that's going to be good enough evidence given my standard for the justification, or rather for the claim that there is in fact a morally relevant distinction. Thus answering the first one. Now, moving on to the different parts that was being given before that monkey came on the stage to basically snooze. Really strange, by the way. So you basically did not give some sort of like response to the idea of the innocent stuff. In fact, you quite literally got right. So your argument is basically just saying that it would not be the case that these fetuses would be innocent by the definition, the conventional definition, which is not true. The definition I've given establishes that a sufficient condition for some given organism or being to be innocent is for them to not be guilty of a crime. So long as something is not guilty of a crime, it would by definition be innocent. That's the first definition, which is generally agreed upon, right? It's the dictionary definition after all. right? You're denying this definition to be something which is conventional, which requires the evidence, by the way. All the evidence favors the idea that this definition is the conventional definition, because in most cases, the dictionary definitions are, in fact, the conventional definitions. It's kind of like, for example, if you see in the dictionary, a bachelor by definition is an unmarried man. Clearly, if something is an unmarried man, that should be a sufficient condition, given that definition, that that person would be a bachelor. And the same logic applies here. So with that being said, the whole argument I've given was based off the innocent human lives principle, which is killing innocent human lives is generally, if not universally, moral in the real world. And so for it to reject the idea that killing a fetus or a zygote, which also classifies as an innocent human life, is also something which is immoral, is for it to be postulated more exceptions, given the rule that's been established, which entails that your position, or the negation to my position, is less parsimonious. And so the evidence would favor my position. That's it. Done talking.
Finally, and I know everyone in this stage is fucking glad that this fat Jamaican bastard stopped speaking. But anyways, look, one, I asked you for the morally relevant distinction, right? And usually whenever I'm asking you that, I'm not asking you to give me some fucking, like, report on people's intuitions about the matter. I'm asking you for a trait, you bastard, right? So when you sit here and report to me people's intuitions, but don't give me the goddamn blood clot trait, right? You aren't answering the fucking question, for one. Two, whenever you give me pro-lifers' intuitions on the matter, right? Especially one, I need you to give me any empirics for it. And two, most people in the world aren't actually fucking pro-life, right? So whenever you're trying to appeal to people's intuitions, you'd find that you're going down a very dangerous road, since most people's intuitions don't actually agree with the proposition that abortion is morally unjustified in any case, right? So I don't know why you even decided to make that argument. The third thing, you bastard, is that the entire thing that your argument hinges on is that taking innocent humans' lives is prima facie immoral, right? If what's in contention is whether or not the fetus is fucking innocent, right, then I don't need to make any exceptions if the fetus doesn't fall under that fucking category. I'm not disagreeing with the dictionary definition, you idiot fuck, right? What I'm doing is I'm specifying what the damn dictionary definition is referencing, you bastard, right? And I'm telling you that for you to be guilty of any crime, you need to have been a moral agent in the past or are currently a moral agent, you dumb fuck, which is why we can see that people who are dead are guilty of fucking genocide, because they used to be moral agents, you stupid prick, right? And that's also the same sort of reason why we wouldn't say rocks are guilty of crimes, you dumb fucking cunt, right? So again, please give me the response, and also give me the response to the analogy you offered, the shitty fucking analogy, you pussy. Go watch my debate lessons, you bastard. Anyways, please give me the response. If you like this type of videos, guys, please remember to like and subscribe. And yeah, let's get it, Apollo.
Yeah, and then all of your sentences with the bastard and prick is just horny. Oh my god. And because of the articulation and the accent and everything just throws me off. But just ignoring that aspect of the specific points you've given, you have made the claim again. The claim that apparently it is the case that for you to be innocent, you have to have moral agency. Now, that's something I don't even grant, by the way. I don't grant the idea that for it to be innocent, you have to have moral agency, and that's not something which is justified in any way whatsoever. I've asked you for the evidence for the claim, and you have not in any way given any sort of evidence supporting the proposition that innocence requires some sort of moral agency. I'm pretty certain that, for example, someone would say that if her grandma was to be in a vegetative state and she was to be accused of a crime, you'd say she's innocent because she could have not done the crime. She's in a vegetative state. She can't even move properly. Right? People would say this about someone like their grandma who's in a vegetative state, for example, even despite the fact that she has no moral agency currently, nor does she have the physical capacity to execute the action which they take to be illegal or immoral. So given just that example alone, which is sufficient to just demolish your trash reasons for the claim that innocence requires moral agency, that should just basically be something which establishes the flawed perspective you have of the semantical schemes that people employ in conversations when they're utilizing the word innocence. Now, moving on from this, even if we ignore the analogy, even if we don't grant the analogy, just look at the definition. The definition of what it means to be innocent is just merely to not be guilty of a crime or offense. So that means just satisfying this condition would be sufficient for it to be innocent. Doesn't matter if you're a chair or a rock or anything, they would still be innocent. They have not done anything wrong. Right? They're not even moral agents to even do anything wrong. right? So that doesn't go against the definition I'm given. And even if you want to basically appeal to a couple of 20 people or so on who thinks the latter, the very fact that the dictionary definition does not establish this being a necessary condition is sufficient for my claim to be justified. Because we know, generally speaking, the dictionary definition relays the conventional attitudes about a particular word and how it's being employed in conversations. And so if we have a case scenario where the dictionary definition maps onto my semantical perspective of the word itself, then that's strong evidence for my semantical perspective being something which maps onto the common parlance. Now, to move on from that point and to address the other part, you said, as for the morally relevant distinction. I get it, moron. I get that you've asked for the morally relevant distinction, you black spook. However, my point is simply that even if one does not present a morally relevant distinction due to not having the specificity of the traits, they don't know the specific traits, they can know that there is a trait without knowing the specific details of the trait. And they would still be justified that there being a morally relevant distinction. So for example, if you have a box which is closed and there's an object inside the box, you can know based off the fact that when you shake the box, you hear something inside it, that there is in fact an object inside the box, even if you don't know the specific details of the object inside the box. Right? So one isn't obligated to basically highlight the specific trait and articulate it clearly for them to be justified in believing that there is in fact a trait which would justify the distinction, the morally relevant distinction. Now, you made another claim that the majority of people believes that pro-choice is the view which is correct. No, that's not even justified. I think you're appealing to the surveys in the US, which is not even the majority of the world, right? What about the other parts of societies? What about the Eastern society or the Western society, for example? What about the Islamic societies or the religious societies, right? Those have to be placed into consideration, right? So for you to make that claim is also something which is unjustified. No sort of sufficient evidence or large enough sample data or sample size to even extrapolate to the idea that this would be correct. And also, we also have what is called more reliable intuitions. I think the intuitions of the pro-lifers are more reliable because they are basically things which are generated as we introspect on the evidence, right? So we have the first layer intuitions, which are the prima facie intuitions, and we have the second layer intuitions, which are the intuitions generated as we deliberate about the specific activity or the action. The latter is more justified because the latter involves deliberation, and rational deliberation is something which is a navigating tool of the world. So we have two truth navigating factors of the second layer intuitions, whereas the first layer intuitions has only one truth navigating factor, thus making it less credible. So that argument doesn't even work, even if I was to grant that the majority of people on the planet were pro-choicers. So address the argument, focus on the arguments, and let's not focus on your cornball insults. Please and thank you.
I could be making jollof rice now, but I'm sitting here debating some fat Jamaican ugly bastard who works at Verizon on a Discord stage. But anyways, I pointed out at the very beginning of my response prior that rocks are not guilty of crimes. We do not say rocks are guilty of crimes. Right? If I were to throw a rock at your fat fucking forehead, right, nobody would say that the rock is guilty of any specific crime because of the fact that the rock is not a moral agent. Then the response was, oh, but we wouldn't say that your grandma isn't innocent. Look, I already included that within the definition of what innocent and guilty means, right? Again, you kept trying to appeal back to the denotation. Like, trivially, I do grant that, sure, maybe like my grandma could be innocent, but that would be only due to the fact that she was a moral agent in the past. I specified within my previous statement that for you to be innocent or to be guilty, right, you need to be currently a moral agent or have been a moral agent in the past, which is why we can also say people like Adolf Hitler are actually guilty of the Holocaust, right, even though they aren't currently moral agents because they are dead. The second thing is, when I ask you for a morally relevant distinction, I expect you to give me a morally relevant distinction, boy, instead of sitting here and saying that, oh, most people's intuitions point towards that fucking direction. That isn't what I asked you. I didn't ask you if most people's intuitions point that direction. I asked you for the distinction, for one. And then two, you said that most people's intuitions upon reflection point towards this direction, right? And they point towards it. Therefore, that's good evidence that what's it called? That there is actually a morally relevant distinction. But you can't give me any argument for that. But yeah, do you have any response? If it's a no-response, I'm just gonna go and make jollof rice, bro. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah, you're trying way too hard and the writer is still failing. It's just really sad. Oh my god. Just to address a couple of things, Jenner, and I want you to focus up and listen closer to what I'm saying, okay? And I'm telling you here is regarding the morally relevant distinction part. I know you expect me to give you the morally relevant distinction. However, what I'm telling you here is that this expectation is not fundamentally relevant. Ultimately, right, even if someone does not have the specific trait that we could say would be the morally relevant distinction, it doesn't matter. It doesn't help your point, nor does it help my point if I don't know the distinction trait specifically. But what does help my point is me being justified in believing that there is in fact a distinction. Not being able to linguistically articulate something is not evidence for this thing not exist. I've given you the box example. I'm still justified in believing this distinction even exists because of the intuition part. So that part just fails completely. Now, to address the other things you've said, specifically, you talked about the idea of, the grandma example, I would grant that because she had moral agency. Well, guess what? You just changed the standard, Shinya. You just conceded because the first standard you've said, and we can roll back the clip. The first standard you've said was simply you saying that what is necessary for there to be some sort of, you could say, innocence in this conversation is for that person to have moral agency. When you say for that person to have moral agency, that's a present tense claim. You're talking about the status quo. So for a being to have moral agency, it has to be, for a being to be innocent, rather, it has to have moral agency. Now you're switching from that standard to a new standard. Now you're moving the goalpost 4 football fields away from the original point by now saying, for you to have innocence, you have to either have moral agency or you have to have had moral agency. Now that's a change of the claim. You realize that the first standard was basically subservient to the reductive hypothetical given the grandma specifically not having moral agency and still being deemed as an innocent creature, you dumb fucking loser. And by the way, we can even grant the idea, which is not even justified, by the way, that simply not doing something wrong is sufficient for there to be some sort of like innocence criteria. And still say that what makes it sufficient is the combination of that aspect and that you could say that object being a biological organism. And so it's the biological organism trait, not the moral agency trait, which is really the necessary condition for innocence to even exist. So that gets equally expected by the opposing hypothesis I'm given regarding the intuitions we have about the matter. And also, again, you granted this being the denotation, and I'm glad you agreed on this. The very fact that you agreed that by definition, this would be the case, by definition, innocence is guaranteed on the basis of there not being an immoral action, then you'd have to agree that my semantical perspective, my semantical investigation of the word here is backed by the dictionary definition, whereas your definition isn't backed by the dictionary definition. And you know what that means? That should mean that it is definitely more likely that my definition is something which maps onto the common parlance, which maps onto what most people think or use the word, the way in which they use the word, because guess what? Majority of definitions in the English Dictionary of Oxford is reflective of the way in which most people use the word. And the reason behind this is because if that was to not be the case, then that would result in a mass decrease in linguistic communicative utility in conversations amongst English speakers, which you're not ready to wrap your head around the concept. So just forget about that point for now and focus on the previous points, okay? Now, the definition part you've lost on the innocence criteria. So that would firmly establish the position, sorry for talking to a long audience, that would firmly establish the position that it is in fact immoral it is in fact an innocent human life. And by it, I'm talking about a fetus or a zygote. And so your position or the negation to my position would commit you to basically saying that there are cases where it is completely okay to kill innocent human lives just because of the fact that you don't want it to exist. And that would literally entail a result in these sort of things, like, for example, it being okay for it to just shoot kids at school, for example, despite them being innocent kids. You mentioned the moral agency criteria does not seem to sufficiently justify the exception either, so that requires further argumentative justification. So with that being said, I'm done talking. Give a response.
Look, there's a few things. So one, again, I've asked you before, and you haven't given me a clear answer why people's intuitions upon deliberation would point towards pro-life. You haven't been able to give me an argument for that, especially when your argument actually hinges on the fact that people's intuitions upon deliberation would point in that direction, right? Aside from that fact, then there's also the second thing is that, look, you're blatantly begging the question, especially when you say that my grandma, or the analogy you gave me, my grandma would be innocent of any specific crime. The reason why she would be innocent in this sort of context would be she was a person in the past, right? And she was a person in the past, right? And she formerly like possessed sentience, right? And because of that fact, she also formerly was a moral agent. And since she formerly was a moral agent, then she would also fit under the category that I provided initially, right? Which would be that she would still be innocent. So if she's still innocent under my own definition, then there's no concession that has actually been provided, right? That's the first thing. The second thing is, look, right? Even if I do grant that I did change my definition, and now I'm extending it to people who had it in the past and who currently have it, it still doesn't apply to the fetus. The argument you're trying to make here is that fetuses are innocent. You would need to give me an argument as to why humans specifically who have never had sentience before can be innocent of any specific crimes. What would make a human who's never been sentient before any more innocent than a rock? Unless you want to commit yourself to the view that rocks are also innocent, right? And most people wouldn't say rocks are innocent of anything, right? Or most people wouldn't even say that like rocks are guilty, even if I were to throw a rock at your head and use it to kill you, right? The reason being because they aren't immoral agents. So please give me a response now instead of wasting my time and gibberating, you fat, smelly breath fuck. Now I'm done.
Yeah, so I see a couple of people coping. I won't say who is coping in the chat, but we know who they are. So just to actually address the nonsensical points you've made, instead of question begging, it's not question begging to literally give an argument and say this argument would be sound given the definition, which is justifiably correct. Now, well, when I say justifiably correct, I obviously mean in the case where the definition is the type of thing which maps onto what most people mean by the given terminology. Now, you talk about the idea that most people would not believe that rocks are innocent of actions. I don't agree with that claim. I don't agree with the intuition that most people would actually say that rocks are not innocent of actions if you were to ask the vast majority of people on the planet. So that's something I don't even agree on. Secondly, as it relates to the sort of like claim you thought was question begging, you made the claim, the really audacious claim, but without any evidence, that supposedly there's a question begging argument in support of the claim that the fetus would be an innocent human life. No, that's not question begging. Now, by definition, it would literally be an innocent human life. It meets the criteria which have established to be the conventional criteria of innocence for it to be something which would in fact be an innocent organism, as well as it also meets the criteria of being a human life because by definition, a human life is the type of thing which would in fact start a conception, which would render zygotes and fetuses from the first to the third gestational period to be the types of things which are in fact human lives. So as far as that is concerned, that's not even a question begging argument. That's just entailed given the definitions of the facts of biology. So I don't even know what you're talking about regarding that. Now, the other part you mentioned, you've asked me for the supposed justification for intuitions with deliberations be more rational or be more justified. That's pretty obvious, right? So we see in multiple cases, despite the general accuracy of intuitions, that there are a plethora of cases where intuitions are inaccurate. And how we come to realize the fact that these intuitions are inaccurate is by deliberating on the intuitions. It's called the reflective equilibrium, of human species. Our ability to reflect on our intuitions and basically test the accuracy of these intuitions and refine these intuitions given all the intuitional data or all the empirical data, which basically helps shape the accuracy of the intuitions. One example is what is called the Ebbinghaus illusion experiment, right? In optics, right? Basically, the Ebbinghaus illusion experiment basically gives you some sort of intuition regarding particular matter, but then when we look back on the intuition, we realize that it is not actually the case that this thing is actually the type of thing which is accurate. Same goes with other illusion experiments in science, like the modularized illusion experiments. The list goes on. So yes, of course, those latter intuitions we have, like for example, in the illusion experiments, are granted to be more reliable because it is the types of intuitions which are generated from reflecting on the initial intuitions, which given the latter intuitions are proven to be incorrect. So in other words, the fetus or the zygote being innocent human lives are claims which have been justified that it would in fact fit into the criteria. Changed the standards, which he has not even responded to yet. He has literally ignored that point because he realized he fucked up badly at that point. And not to mention, he has also basically not even addressed the idea of the intuitions part regarding the morally relevant distinction and how I don't need to articulate the specificity of those intuitions, or sorry, that specific distinction, for me to be justified in there being a distinction. So all the arguments you're giving here doesn't work. It failed badly, really terribly. And you'd have to be a special type of fucking retard to look at this guy and listen to how he sounds and think he sounds convincing, or he's actually doing a good job with this debate right now. I'm done talking.
Is that you consenting to us sexting for the next few days? Sexting? Whoa, no. Right? She needed to say no 4 times so there was no skepticism on this guy's part, just to get that clear, for one. Also, 2, yes, I can grant that fetuses are human lives. Like, even if I do grant that, I don't grant that all human lives are innocent, right? Again, you just need to give an argument for that. Specifically, whenever we're speaking about definitions in this sort of context, right, it needs to be the way in which you're defining the term needs to be how most people actually use it. You can't give me a good reason why most people would actually consider blades of grass guilty if I were to beat you over the head and kill you with a blade of grass. Right? You haven't been able to give me an argument for that, for one. Also, I noticed how you sneakily dodged the analogy I gave you at the very beginning of our conversation, which is if Mercury came into existence without sentience, with his fist embedded into your urethra, right, and he was causing you to have extreme levels of pain for a 9-month period, would you be morally justified in taking Mercury's life? The answer would obviously be yes, because he's violating your rights without a sufficient reason, right? And trivially, there's no symmetry breaker between that case and the abortion case, right? So even if you do want to posit that then the fetus would be innocent, right, which I still haven't granted yet, you would also need to grant that, yeah, you would be morally unjustified for removing this guy from your urethra, right? Again, that's obviously a reductio. I hope you wouldn't grant that. Also, look, I have 5 minutes before my sister comes downstairs and kills me for not making jollof rice. So please give me the response. Also, the last thing you said about intuitions being better upon reflection, that's just a mistrack. So, yeah, man.
Because he couldn't address the intuition part, he basically lied about it being a mistrack when he quite literally questioned why it would be the case that those intuitions would be more reliable. To address the other part, the Mercury example you've given would be consistent with my position, right? Because if you're going to be talking about the case scenario where you're removing the fetus from a specific person's urethra, for example, because of the fact that you're preventing a direct negative consequence, okay? That specifically would be expected under my view because my view has exceptions in it. Certain exceptions, for example, within my viewpoint, for example, would be obviously death-threatening case scenarios, obviously some sort of explicitly, consequentially bad case scenarios. And by the way, fetus, when you're talking about fetus, I don't know why you're going to say you're not talking about fetus. That would just be something you're not even addressing the actual argument there. But as it relates to what I was saying, okay, now, in the case of a human organism, right, we know for a fact that these types of beings, which are going to be a part of the human organism or the human species, would be a fetus from the first trimester to the 3rd trimester, and before that, there would be a zygote. Okay. Now, I'm saying that with respect to human organisms, okay, and the innocence of such, it would be the case that it is morally justified, it is morally unjustified, just to correct myself, to terminate these beings just for the sake of you not wanting it to exist. Now, the hypothetical you've given does not reflect a case scenario where it's just terminating a human organism just because you don't want it to exist. So it wouldn't even be capturing the essence of my argument or my position for it to even be qualified as a successful counter-argument towards my position. That's first and foremost. Now, moving on from this, you always say, oh, I'll grant it to be innocent. Well, I don't care about what you don't grant. We're talking about the hard facts here, the bulletproof, the proof here we're talking about. Okay? The hard facts suggest, by definition, it would be innocent. Now, you'd have to then say that your definition of innocence is proprietary. It's something which is not mapping onto the common parlance, in which by then we can just define anything into being a moral action or a moral action. We can just define our positions into being correct. If we're going to play with semantics and just use proprietary definitions, which people don't generally use, I've proven the latter. I've proven that my definition is more linguistically reliable, more linguistically useful, and maps onto the common parlance by appealing to the denotation and also by establishing the correlation between that and the denotation, which then resulted in me using an inductive case of denotations from the English dictionary mapping onto the common parlance. So the definition point on innocence, you've failed on that part. You've also still yet to address the idea that you've switched the gold standards from you stated that it is the case that it is moral, to, or rather a necessary condition of innocence, I should say, is having moral agency. To you saying if it had moral agency in the past, it would be something which would qualify to have the possibility to be innocent. So you changed the standards on that point. You've not addressed the intuition part about reliability differences. You've also not proven the idea that the vast majority of people on the planet are pro-choicers or disagrees with my specific version of pro-life. And you've not also established that's why it would be the case that one ought to give a morally relevant distinction given the relevant details I've given here and as to how intuitions would be sufficient to be justified in there being a morally relevant distinction, which is fundamental to my claim. And last but not least, just pure insults. Well, for the main part, the only thing that really make out of what you're saying is just the insults part for the main part. So, like, really and truly, I want you to focus morally on the arguments because I know for a fact the reason as to why you're doing all of this sort of rhetorical shenanigans, right, is because you don't really have any arguments. You don't have any arguments to support your claims. You don't have any good arguments to attack my arguments nor my position. And most importantly, you don't have any good responses towards the evidence I've given for my position. So that's basically just it. I'm done talking. If you have any more responses, add the responses onto it.
No, please stay. Say please. Do you like it when I say please? That was you, Apollo, by the way. In a girl's DMs. Keep in mind, this is the same girl he was calling ugly like 2 weeks after. But anyways, regardless of that, one, you said that the reason why it would be morally justified is because there's some negative consequence which instantiates itself after that, right? And I'm asking you specifically, one, would it not be a negative consequence for you to have your rights violated, right? Especially having your rights violated in such a gratuitous manner, such as being forced to force another human being out of your vagina. Now, I know you've never experienced that before, right? But it's quite a painful experience for one. Two, most people don't have abortions through just because they don't want the baby to exist. Most people have abortions due to poverty reasons. You can look this up, it's obvious, right? So the reason why they have these abortions is for two reasons, actually. One, they want to improve the quality of life, not only for themselves, but also for the future babies that they have, right? And two, they also don't want their rights to be violated. If those are not good enough reasons to terminate the life of the fetus, then I don't know what to tell you. For all of the innocent stuff, I've already responded to this. You're fat, ugly, Jewish, gay, and you have no friends. That's it.
Yeah, so say that something is obvious, you can look it up, it's not an argument firstly. So that's just Hitchens' razor right there. No evidence for that claim about the property rights stuff. About the other arguments about you saying, oh, it's rights violation, therefore it has to be consequentially bad. No, retard. I can give you plenty of examples where there's rights violations which are completely morally justified. In fact, for it to have a sustainable and consistent and consequentially good ethical system in a given society, there has to be rights violation. I'll give you one example. So the right for someone to use a gun, right? Everyone has the right to, well, not everyone, but yes, a lot of people have the right to use a gun, for example. And it is still the case that there are laws which are placed into perspective or into check to basically prevent these people from exercising these rights in certain case scenarios. Like, for example, using the right to shoot a gun to basically shoot a baby for no reason. There are laws which are placed into check, which puts a restriction on that right to basically prevent that from being a justified action legally and morally. You can also agree with property rights. We can grant property rights exist and put a restriction on that. A restriction which prevents the justification or the justifiability of abortion. Okay, so just merely appeal into a particular right existence and say, oh, this right exists, therefore it has to be something which is universally applicable. It's not, that's not even true, right? There are plenty of case scenarios, like the one I've just mentioned, of there being restrictions on human rights that we possess in a given society for the sake of maintaining a good ethical status, right? Sometimes rights violation is indispensable for a morally good action, right? So the whole idea of appealing to the restriction of rights which are entailed from my position doesn't really do your argument any justice, does it? Now, the other section, so the pro-choice part, the pro-choice claim about the vast majority believe in that, not proven. The claim regarding the vast majority of people believing that rocks would not be innocent, not proven. The claim regarding the idea that it is not going to be the case that you would be justified in believing that it is innocent is also something which has not been proven. Not to mention, you've yet to actually address the parts about you switching the standards again. You've dodged this for the fourth time. You've also dodged the claim or the arguments regarding me establishing the lack of dialectical necessity for me to basically point out the morally relevant distinctive trait for me to be justified to believe in that such trait exists. So on all of those points respectively, you have lost objectively. And not to mention regarding the innocent part, or rather the fact of me establishing a fetus and a zygote by definition being an innocent human life. You have basically not even attacked that part either. You've not attacked the definition part. So in other words, it follows from all the prior events of the same debate that you're getting destroyed in currently, which is why I resorted to the atoms every single time in your responses, that a fetus and a zygote would be an innocent human life. Now, then, what we can then do there is establish that denying my position would entail that it is okay in a plethora of cases for you to just kill innocent human lives just because you don't want it to exist. And that specifically is morally unintuitive. And that moral intuition right there is more reliable than the prior intuition that people have about fetuses not having moral value in some cases, because of the fact that my intuition here is generated from another the fundamental intuitions in amalgamation with reasoning about the matter, deliberating about the intuitions, which makes it more cognitively reliable. And last but not least, given all of these specific things, like it being generally immoral to kill innocent human lives, which a fetus and zygote would be, it would be the case that it would be more parsimonious to claim that the pro-life position in this particular hypothetical would actually be, or in this particular debate, I should say, would actually be justified. And for it to assert exceptions, so the general trend of this being the case would entail the negation to be less parsimonious, and so that would objectively determine that the majority of evidence favors my position beyond the reasonable doubt. That's it.
I almost forgot I could unmute myself. I have perms. Look, bro, can we conclude? I sent you the statistic in chat. We can conclude, bro. I won't go cook. Please, give me a conclusion. No. Actually, no. Sorry, I'll conclude. Never mind. In conclusion,
I don't know why he was kicked off the stage, but I'm gonna make a poll for everyone to vote on announcements in a second. All right, guys, you guys can vote up in the polls. All right, so everyone can just like fucking vote. Let's get it, man. Let's get it. Okay, guys, like it's kind of awkward now. Like there's 39 guys in the audience. Fuck.
Okay, yeah, okay, wait, unban Frida because Frida said he wants to get unbanned. But
Why
yeah,
was